Hey again. If you're still here, welcome back to the candlelight. We've eaten with farmers, priests, and kings. Now it's time to sit in on the dinners that decided wars, sealed marriages, and occasionally ended with someone pretending they weren't offended by the soup. Because in Egypt, food wasn't just food. It was politics served warm. The politics of a plaything. Pharaoh's court was basically a never-ending dinner party with paperwork. Every visit from a foreign envoy, every marriage negotiation, every new alliance, it all started with an invitation to eat. You didn't shake hands in ancient diplomacy. You broke bread. Banquets were, how Egypt said, we're civilized, we're rich, and yes, we can feed everyone without blinking. It wasn't bragging, it was reassurance. A starving kingdom can't host a feast, so when envoys from Babylon or Hatti arrived, they didn't get military parades. They got roasted goose, figs, honey, wine, and a front row seat to Egypt's confidence. The table, as a throne v banquet hall, was as political as any battlefield. Everything, layout, seating, even lighting, was calculated. Guests sat by rank. Foreigners near the back, family near the king. Everyone knew their place because the plates told them so. The more food in front of you, the more important you were. It was ancient Egypt's version of a seating chart mixed with a personality test. And yes, Pharaoh always ate first. Not just because he was hungry, but because the first bite was a blessing. When the divine king ate, the world was symbolically fed. Everyone else waited, smiling politely and pretending not to drool. Marriage, by many royal marriages, were rarely about love. They were about grain, gold, and geography. But the ceremonies always ended in feasts that looked like love, if as Quinted. Picture it. Torches glowing against limestone walls. Tables heavy with dates and roast duck. Musicians playing the same 3 notes for hours. The new queen, often foreign, sits beside a pharaoh she barely knows, trying not to look terrified while everyone cheers. Food bridged the gap. You couldn't speak the same language, but you could both appreciate good bread. That was diplomacy in its purest, most edible form. When Egypt married foreign princesses, Babylonian, Hittite, Mitanni, they sent caravans loaded with grain, honey, spices, and preserved meat. In return, Egypt shipped gold and linen. Marriages were exchange programs with better catering. And somewhere in between all that logistics, a small banquet happened. The families toasted, the scribes recorded, and someone definitely made an awkward speech about eternal friendship. It was ancient PR. One meal at a time. The feast of power now. Not every royal dinner was peaceful. Sometimes feasts were weapons. A pharaoh who wanted to intimidate rivals didn't draw his sword. He hosted a festival. He fed thousands, built new ovens, filled warehouses with beer, and made sure word spread that Egypt could drown its enemies in honey cakes if it felt like it. Ramses II mastered this. After the Battle of Kadesh, he threw a victory festival so massive that even the temple walls bragged about it. The message was simple. I have enough food to feed an army after fighting one. It wasn't about generosity. It was marketing. Guests of gold foreign dignitaries left these events dizzy from beer and diplomacy. They'd write home about Egypt's wealth. They poured wine like water. The bread was white as the moon. The geese never ended. Exactly the effect Pharaoh wanted. Better to conquer hearts through stomachs than risk another desert campaign, and it worked. Egypt's reputation as the land of plenty lasted for centuries. Even Greek historians, arriving long after its peak, still described Nile feasts like fairy tales. They missed the bureaucracy behind the magic. The granaries, the ledgers, the sweating cooks. But maybe that's what Egypt wanted, for everyone to see only abundance. Priests and politicians sighed Egypt itself. Food also bought loyalty. The pharaoh rewarded priests and officials with land, but also with rations. Bread, beer, meat, measured out daily. A priest with full storerooms didn't rebel. A scribe whose family ate well didn't question the tax rate. Food kept peace where armies couldn't. You could call it edible politics, rule through rations. And for 3,000 years, it worked. The gift economy, there was another layer too, gifting. Every major festival, the pharaoh sent baskets of food to favored nobles, fruit, honey, fine bread. In return, they sent tributes back. Geese, jars of wine, exotic oils. The entire elite economy revolved around politely trading calories. Even letters between royal courts mention it. One Babylonian king once complained that Egypt's latest gift of gold was smaller than expected, but thanked them for the wine anyway. Diplomacy with mild sarcasm. The role of women now. Royal women understood food politics better than anyone. Queens like Tai and Nefertari hosted banquets to strengthen alliances. They sat at the center of the table, an honor usually reserved for men, and used conversation as softly as soldiers used swords. Inscriptions describe Tai welcoming foreign envoys with grace and a table of plenty. Translation: she charmed them while feeding them senseless. No war required. Cleopatra would perfect that art later, centuries down the line, using feasts as seduction, turning politics into dinner theater. But the idea was much older. Egypt taught her how. Theaters of abundance, every banquet doubled as propaganda. Artists recorded them on temple walls, exaggerated for effect. Rows of tables, mountains of food, perfectly symmetrical. Reality was probably less polished. Flies, heat, maybe a few overcooked ducks. But perception mattered more than taste. If the gods saw abundance on earth, they'd maintain abundance in heaven. And if commoners saw their king surrounded by endless food, they'd believe the country was thriving. Bread was belief. Beer was proof. The sound of celebration. Imagine one of those nights. Torches everywhere. The Nile glittering in the dark. Musicians playing slow, hypnotic rhythms. The smell of roasting meat and beer drifting over the palace walls. The pharaoh lifts his cup. Guests cheer softly. Someone begins to sing, a hymn, maybe, or a toast disguised as prayer. And for a moment, Egypt feels like it will last forever. Because how could a world that eats this well ever fall? When the food runs out, but of course, it did. Even divine kitchens aren't immune to drought. When the Nile failed, so did the banquets. Records from later dynasties tell of cancelled festivals, empty granaries, and anxious priests reciting double offerings to fill the absence. Feasts became symbolic again, words replacing bread. That's how you know things were bad. When a civilization famous for abundance had to pretend it still had enough to spare, even the gods, it seems, had to diet sometimes. The idea never died. Every time later empires dined in splendor, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, they borrowed Egypt's script. The same gestures, the same symbols, power expressed through food. Even today, the phrase a royal feast owes something to the Nile. We still equate plenty with peace, abundance with authority. That's Egypt whispering through history, reminding us that survival is political and dinner is diplomacy. So, if you think about it, every time a world leader hosts a state dinner, they're reenacting an Egyptian ritual, minus the incense and crocodiles. The same choreography, the same message. We have enough. We can share. We are strong. 3,000 years later, still the same table. The torches burn low now. The air feels heavy, not from smoke, but from satisfaction. The guests lean back, eyes half closed, hands resting on their knees. The music fades into background hum, flutes, harps, and the occasional clap from someone who's already had too much beer. This isn't just a feast anymore. It's theater. The pharaoh sits still at the head of the table, wearing gold that glints every time the fire flickers. No one speaks unless spoken to. The meal itself has ended, but the performance continues, each gesture rehearsed, each silence meaningful. Because in Egypt, even fullness was a message. An empty table meant failure. A table left covered in food meant the gods had blessed the land beyond need. They didn't waste food out of arrogance. They did it to prove that Egypt had more than enough to spare. Excess was reassurance. Food wasn't only about comfort. It was a political tool as sharp as any blade. When the pharaoh sent gifts of grain to neighboring kingdoms during famine, it wasn't just generosity, it was power disguised as mercy. Egypt, the land of plenty, feeding the world, and the gesture always came with expectation. Today, a gift of wheat, tomorrow a tribute of loyalty. So when foreign kings praised Egypt's generosity, they knew what they were really saying. We depend on you. Don't forget us when the river rises. Inside the country, the same rules applied. If you were a local governor, your best path to promotion wasn't a military victory. It was throwing a really good feast. A celebration big enough for the pharaoh to hear about it. Hundreds fed. Temples honored. Beer flowing so freely that it spilled into the streets. It was Egypt's ancient version of good PR. Feed the people, feed the gods, feed your career, and for the most part, it worked. The more food you gave, the safer your power became. No one rebels with a full stomach. But behind all that generosity was control. The pharaoh owned every field, every harvest, every cow and fish and onion by divine right. So when he gave, he wasn't sharing, he was returning what was already his. The gesture made him look merciful, but it also reminded everyone who owned the grain. Bread was kindness, bread was control, bread was law. Egypt didn't need tyrants when it had taxes disguised as blessings. Still, for all its strategy, Egyptian feasting had a strange softness to it, a kind of grace. They didn't celebrate to show off. They celebrated to stay in rhythm. Every feast tied back to the same cosmic cycle, the Nile's flood, the crop's rebirth, the return of life after drought. So even the most political dinner carried a whisper of gratitude. No matter how powerful the pharaoh was, he still raised his cup to the river. He still thanked the gods before the first bite. Power didn't cancel humility. It just polished it with gold. Let's wander through one of those royal halls again. The feast is ending now. Servants move quietly, collecting dishes, refilling cups one last time. Laughter lingers, low and sleepy. Someone plays a soft melody, just enough to fill the silence. Outside, the desert wind moves through the palms. The torches sputter, and you can almost feel the hum of history settling over the table, like the last note of a song that's been playing for 3,000 years. For a moment, the line between power and prayer disappears. It's just people, tired, full, content. The same as ever by dawn. This room will be empty again. The leftovers will go to servants or temple storerooms. The floors will be swept. The gold will be polished. And in a few days, another feast will begin for a visiting prince or a temple festival, or simply because Egypt loved to remind itself that it was alive. This cycle of eating, thanking, rebuilding was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. It didn't rise on conquest alone. It rose on routine. The kind that says, we eat, therefore we exist. There's a quiet lesson buried in that. Egypt didn't survive for 3,000 years because it changed. It survived because it didn't. Every loaf of bread, every cup of beer, every feast and offering, all followed the same script. Predictable, peaceful, permanent. And while the rest of the world spun into chaos, Egypt stayed still, like the river that fed it. Maybe that's what they understood better than anyone, that eternity doesn't roar, it simmers slowly. The banquet is over now. The last servants leave. The torches fade to embers. The pharaoh stands, nods once, and disappears behind a curtain embroidered with stars. The guests rise, bow, and file out silently, their sandals whispering across the stone. And when the room is finally empty, it's just the sound of the Nile again, calm, eternal, almost kind. All that remains is the scent of roasted grain, fruit, and wine, the faint trace of laughter still clinging to the walls, and the memory of a people who believed that eating together, even in silence, could hold the world together. They were right in their way. Food was the thread that tied Egypt's gods, kings, and workers into one long story. Not war, not glory. Dinner, so let the fires go out. Let the moon take over the Nile. The banquet is done, and Egypt sleeps again, full and still. Somewhere, the leftovers cool on golden plates, waiting, perhaps, for morning when the same rituals begin again. Because that's what Egypt always promised. The bread will return, the river will rise, and the world for now is fed. The torches outside the banquet hall are almost gone now. Only a few embers flicker near the floor, turning the stone walls a soft red. Inside, the servants move slowly, sweeping, stacking jars, whispering to one another in the half-dark. This is the part no one ever paints, the cleanup, the part after the glory. The feast is over, but its weight still hangs in the air. You can almost hear the echo of laughter, the soft clatter of bronze bowls, the rhythmic pluck of a harp fading down a corridor. A few plates remain untouched, a half-eaten fig, a cup of wine turned flat, a smear of honey on a dish shaped like a lotus. The small, human evidence that even in a divine kingdom, appetite had limits. Outside, the Nile flows quietly, pretending not to have seen any of it. It's patient, ancient, disinterested in who sits on the throne this decade. Tomorrow it will rise, and the same river that fed the pharaoh will feed the farmer. That's Egypt's secret. Power was always temporary, but the meal was eternal. By the time the first light touches the palace walls, the servants will be back in the kitchens. The fires will be relit, the dough mixed, the beer stirred, bread again, beer again, life again. The banquet may have ended, but Egypt's hunger for rhythm never did. The guests who left the feast will wake in their villas and boast about the food. They'll talk about the sweetness of the honey, the fragrance of the wine, the grace of the queen. Someone will swear they heard the gods whisper through the harp music. Someone else will say they saw the pharaoh smile, which means the floods will come on time this year. And just like that, dinner becomes prophecy, because that was the true power of Egyptian feasting. It wasn't about eating, it was about believing. Every banquet said, "The world is still in order. The gods are satisfied. The Pharaoh is strong. The land is alive. You didn't need speeches. You just needed full plates." Even the poorest farmer, miles away, would feel it in the air. He'd hear the drums faintly across the river and think, the palace is feasting again. That meant stability. It meant hope in a land built on cycles, flood, drought, harvest. Food was the one constant that held meaning. Egypt didn't need new gods or revolutions. It just needed bread that kept rising. And maybe that's why the ancient world envied them. Other empires boasted of armies and conquest. Egypt boasted of feasts. While others fought for territory, Egypt invited you to dinner. And somehow, that worked better than any army. You can resist a sword. You can't resist hospitality. When foreign princes came to Egypt, they always returned home changed. Not because of gold or gifts, but because of what they'd seen. An entire civilization moving at the pace of a meal. Slow, measured, timeless. They took those habits home. The ceremonies, the offerings, the grand displays of food, and built their own copies. Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, all learned the art of the diplomatic dinner from the Nile. So in a way, every royal feast that followed, in every corner of history, was Egypt eating again. But no feast lasts forever. And even here, the day eventually ended. The wine dried. The music faded. The candles burned down to their last flicker. The pharaoh rose from his seat, silent and heavy with thought. The guests bowed low, the servants froze, and the hall, for one perfect moment, held its breath. Then he turned and left through the tall doors carved with stars into the shadow of the palace, where the cool air smelled faintly of myrrh and ash. The hall exhaled. The river kept moving, and the feast of power became memory again. If you walked through those ruins today, you'd still find traces. Broken cups, charred bread, a single fishbone buried in dust. The leftovers of eternity. Not grand, not golden, just real. Proof that even gods had crumbs. So ends Egypt's feast, not with thunder, but with silence. The same silence that follows every good meal. Satisfied, still, and a little holy, because in the end, what kept Egypt alive wasn't glory or conquest. It was the simple, stubborn act of sitting down, sharing food, and trusting that tomorrow they'd do it all again. The hall sleeps. The river sighs, the story lingers, and Egypt, once more, dreams of abundance, quiet, endless, and kind. This is the gentlest part of the journey. The part where Egypt stops eating for survival and starts cooking for forever. Because in the Egyptian mind, death wasn't an ending. It was a very long dinner party that never ran out of bread, packing for eternity when someone died in Egypt. You didn't just bury them. You packed them. Bread, beer, meat, fruit, oil, salt, honey, enough to feed the soul on its trip through the underworld. They called it provisioning the way, the life force that lingered after death. The car still needed food. Not symbolic food. Actual food, preferably fresh, or at least dry enough to last the voyage. And so, funerals looked suspiciously like picnics. Servants carried baskets, jars, trays. Priests muttered prayers. Someone always dropped something, probably an onion. The tomb became a kitchen, and the kitchen became a prayer. Menus for the dead, there was a standard list. Bread first, because bread was life. Buyer second, because life needed bubbles. Then onions, garlic, leeks, lettuce, fish, and small cuts of beef or duck. Dessert was dates or honey cakes, because even the dead deserved sweetness. The wealthy had variety, the poor simplicity, but no one went hungry, at least not in theory, on the walls. Artists painted even more food, piles of loaves, jars of beer, tables overflowing with fruit. Because if you couldn't afford the real thing, a picture worked just as well. The Egyptians believed an image, properly blessed, became the thing it showed. Painted bread fed you. Painted beer refreshed you. It was art with calories. The afterlife pantry tomb inventories read like grocery receipts. 400 loaves of bread, 200 jars of beer, 50 onions, 10 ducks, 1 jar of honey for good behavior. All sealed carefully in pottery jars, labeled in ink, stacked by category. The earliest examples date back over 5,000 years. And when archaeologists open them now, they still smell faintly sweet. Honey never spoils. So somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, a jar of 3,000-year-old honey could, technically, still go on toast. It's the world's oldest preserved meal, and possibly the most patient food, as faith feeding the dead wasn't superstition. It was responsibility. If the living forgot to bring offerings, the dead might grow restless. Hungry ghosts whispering through dreams, so families returned to tombs regularly, bringing new bread and beer, lighting incense, whispering the names of the departed. To be remembered was to be nourished. To be forgotten was to starve. Egyptians didn't say rest in peace. They said, in essence, eat well forever. The smell of forever, the smell of forever. Imagine a tomb right after sealing. Cool air, stone walls painted in red, blue, and gold. A table set before the sarcophagus, real loaves, glazed ducks, clay jars sealed with mud. Someone lights incense one last time. The smoke drifts, curls, disappears, then silence. For thousands of years, the food stays. The air dries it out. The darkness keeps it safe. Centuries pass, and still the bread waits. It's both heartbreaking and strangely comforting. An entire civilization that believed so deeply in continuity it fed its dead just in case. Recipes for immortality. Some tombs included written recipes, essentially instructions for eternity. How to bake offering bread, how to brew beer for the cup. They even specified measurements: handfuls of barley, cups of water, spoonfuls of honey. Ordinary details preserved on sacred stone. The message was clear. The soul must never go hungry, and heaven must taste familiar. Eternal life, yes, but preferably with good bread. The priests' rounds after burial, priests maintained the food cycle. Every day or week, depending on wealth, they'd enter the chapel, present new offerings, recite prayers, and take away the old food. Nothing wasted. Priests ate what the gods and spirits didn't physically consume. The system was self-sustaining. Faith fed bellies. Bellies kept faith alive. Practical holiness at its best. When belief spoiled, of course, not all tombs stayed sealed. Looters came. Time eroded walls. Bread turned to dust. Wine evaporated. By the late period, many offerings were symbolic only. A clay loaf here, a painted jar there. Faith adjusted to economy. But even then, the gesture remained, because the Egyptians weren't feeding bodies. They were feeding memory. And memory, unlike bread, doesn't mold. Feasts of the dead on festival days, the feast of the valley, the beautiful festival of the desert. Families picnicked at tombs. They laid out food, shared it with their ancestors, told stories, poured beer on the ground as offerings. It sounds somber, but it wasn't. It was warm, communal, a reunion with the invisible. Children ran between graves. Mothers sang. Someone probably complained about the heat. Death wasn't a tragedy. It was another address on the same street. Echoes in the dark today. Archaeologists find those moments frozen in dust, crumbs, grape seeds, fish bones. Nothing grand, just the ordinary leftovers of devotion. If you stand in one of those tombs now, it's quiet enough to hear your own breathing. But if you close your eyes, you can almost smell the bread, the faint sweetness of barley, the trace of smoke, the ghost of a meal still doing its job, feeding eternity, the simple truth for all their gold and mystery. The Egyptians were practical. They didn't believe in dying hungry. They prepared for the next world the same way they survived this one, with planning, patience, and carbs. It wasn't grandeur that made them eternal. It was consistency. Bake, brew, repeat. In life, in death, forever. The last offerings somewhere along the Nile. Under sand and silence, there's still a sealed jar filled with beer that hasn't seen light since it was brewed. The liquid inside is thick, dark, and undrinkable now. But in a way, it's still working. Still keeping a promise made to a soul thousands of years ago. That's what food meant to Egypt. Not luxury, not indulgence, just a quiet assurance that no one, not even the dead, would ever be left unfed. The torches fade. The tomb breathes. The river hums outside, eternal and unbothered. Egypt sleeps again, full, patient, waiting for the next sunrise that has already happened 5,000 times. The tomb is dark now. The priests are gone. Only the painted loaves and jars remain, glowing faintly in lamplight that has been trapped in the pigment for 4 millennia. If you stand here long enough, you start to understand what they were trying to do. They weren't clinging to life. They were repeating it. Every loaf, every jar, every carved duck was a small, stubborn way of saying, "We will keep going." They didn't believe eternity was a grand palace in the sky. They imagined it as a kitchen that never closed. Bread always rising, beer always brewing, family always visiting. When archaeologists first opened these tombs, they expected treasure. What they found were leftovers, crumbs in jars, rings of dried oil, seeds that once sat on a platter. At first it seemed disappointing, no gold, just groceries. But then they realized this was the real story. Egypt didn't build its immortality from gold. It built it from groceries. A loaf lasts longer than a legend. If you believe hard enough, you can picture the moment when the tomb was sealed. The final priest, whispering through incense smoke, placing the last loaf beside the coffin. He pauses, maybe sighs. He knows the soul inside will never taste this bread. But that isn't the point. The act itself is what keeps the world in balance. He says the prayer, presses the clay seal, and steps away. Behind him, the food waits in darkness, eternal, untouched, faithful. Thousands of years pass. Empires rise, fall, forget. But underground, Egypt keeps eating. Every loaf, every jar, every offering still doing its quiet job. Feeding memory. You can't taste it, but you can feel it. The same comfort that comes from a warm meal after a long day. the certainty that someone, somewhere, thought to feed you. That's what the Egyptians left behind. Not monuments, not riches, a feeling, even now, when scientists study the old bread under glass. When they open a jar of honey that still gleams amber after 3,000 years, it's hard not to smile. You can almost hear the echo of laughter from that ancient kitchen, the scrape of a clay pot, the smell of barley in the air. It's still working, still keeping the promise, because, in the end, the Egyptians never separated hunger from holiness. To feed someone, living or dead, was the purest act of faith. It meant you trusted that life would continue in some form, somewhere. That's what every offering said. Here, take this. You'll need it. And so, the oldest civilization on earth built its eternity out of small, ordinary kindnesses. Loaves, beer, onions, honey. The world remembers the pyramids, but it survives on the bread. The tomb is silent again. The air cool. The river hums above, steady as breathing, and somewhere in the dust, a crumb of bread still waits. Patient, certain, eternal. We've walked through palaces, temples, and tombs. We've watched kings eat like gods, and gods eat like kings. Now we return to the real Egypt, the mud brick houses, the courtyards, the kitchens that smelled like bread, smoke, and a little bit of eternity. Because for all the gold and grandeur, Egypt's real miracles happened in the homes of people who couldn't even spell Pharaoh. They didn't have tomb chapels or sculpted servants, but they still fed their gods, and they still believed that every meal mattered. The hearth of the Nile picture, a small home near the riverbank. The walls are clay, the roof patched with palm leaves. A few clay jars sit in the corner, grain, oil, beer. The oven glows faintly red, the kind of heat that never really leaves the air. A woman kneels, shaping dough. Her child watches, yawning, half asleep. A pot simmers. The smell of onions fills the room. She hums softly, a tune she doesn't remember learning. That song is older than her language. It's a prayer disguised as habit, because here, cooking wasn't just survival. It was worship. Gods of the kitchen Egyptians didn't wait for temples to find the divine. They invited it home. Every house had a small altar, sometimes just a shelf, sometimes a niche in the wall, dedicated to the household gods. Base, the dwarf protector with a lion's mane, guarded kitchens and childbirth alike. Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess, watched over mothers and meals with equal patience. And sometimes, even Osiris got a loaf left out overnight, just to be polite. These weren't grand rituals. They were gestures, small, human thank yous for making it through another day. A piece of bread placed on the shelf. A drop of beer poured on the ground. A muttered word of gratitude to no one in particular. That was faith. Egyptian style, quiet, constant, and usually covered in flour. When cooking was prayer in temple records, priests chanted to gods. At home, people prayed through recipes. When you baked bread, you whispered the same words every time. When you poured beer, you recited the same blessings your grandmother did. When you fed your family, you believed, on some level, you were feeding the balance of the world. They didn't see a difference between sacred and ordinary. Stirring a pot and offering a loaf were both acts of creation, and creation, to an Egyptian, was the most divine thing anyone could do. Meals of meaning. An average dinner wasn't glamorous, but it was alive with small rituals. Bread first, always bread, then beer, vegetables, maybe fish, and before eating, the family paused, not to pray formally, but to thank the gods for the flood, the crops, the hands that made it. They didn't bow their heads. They just breathed together for a second, in silence. Then they ate. Food was never just consumption. It was participation in nature, in faith. In the endless rhythm of the Nile, the invisible guests Egyptians always assumed the gods were watching. Sometimes helping, sometimes judging, sometimes just curious. So a small portion of every meal was set aside for them. A bit of bread, a drop of beer, a handful of lentils. It wasn't wasted. It was shared. A kind of divine tax, but paid in kindness instead of coin. Even in the humblest huts, someone remembered to whisper, "Eat with us," and that whisper, carried through thousands of kitchens, became one of the most enduring prayers in human history. Food, fate, and family to an Egyptian. Everything started and ended with food. Birth, weddings, funerals, all had their own dishes, their own flavors of faith. New mothers were fed honey cakes for strength. Weddings featured beer brewed with dates, sweet and symbolic. Funerals were marked by meals shared in silence. Food that comforted the living as much as it honored the dead. Even offerings to the gods changed with life's milestones. A child's first bread loaf might be shaped like a bird. An elder's last offering might be a simple onion. Each one said the same thing. Thank you for the flood. Thank you for the harvest. Thank you for letting us stay another year. The rhythm of belief faith in Egypt didn't live in temples. It lived in repetition, in doing the same things every day, with the same quiet care, baking, brewing, offering, cleaning. The divine wasn't a spectacle. It was a schedule, and food was the calendar. Each sunrise brought the same recipe. Each flood, the same hope. Each year, the same meal served to gods and people alike. It never got boring. It got eternal, feeding the future even as dynasties fell and gods changed names. People kept cooking. Greek rule, Roman rule, it didn't matter. The bread stayed, the beer stayed, the habit of sharing stayed, and that's maybe Egypt's greatest legacy. Not its monuments, not its mathematics, but its meals, the belief that the world holds together one loaf at a time, that feeding others is the purest kind of power, that abundance isn't wealth, it's gratitude. The taste of time if you could time travel and sit with one of those families, barefoot, tired, laughing quietly as the night breeze moves through the reeds. You'd find the food familiar. Bread that smells like barley. Beer that tastes faintly sour but comforting. Fish roasted over fire, seasoned with salt and onion. Figs pass from hand to hand. It's the same meal you'd eat anywhere in the world today, in 100 forms. Different kitchen, same meaning. Because the Egyptians weren't just feeding themselves. They were feeding us, the future, with memory. Morning again. The sun slides over the river, and Egypt wakes up in the same rhythm it has for thousands of years. A farmer steps outside and stretches. Somewhere, a pot starts to boil. A child laughs at a chicken that refuses to behave. Life, once again, begins with breakfast. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. Just the smell of bread and barley beer and dust warmed by the sun. Every small act is a prayer. Every bite is a continuation of the oldest promise the Nile ever made. I will feed you if you remember me. The ordinary miracle historians love to talk about pyramids, temples, and kings. But the real miracle was always the meal. The fact that, despite droughts, taxes, wars, and the occasional crocodile. Egypt kept everyone fed for centuries. The system worked not because of grandeur, but because of routine. People cared about the details. How much grain to store, how much to grind, how to share without wasting. There's a quiet dignity in that kind of order. A civilization built on patience, not conquest. A feast in silence at night. Families gathered around small fires. They didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say after a long day in the fields. Someone would tell a story. Someone would hum. And when the bread came out of the oven, still hot, everyone stopped for a moment. That was Egypt's truest religion. The silence before eating. A few seconds of stillness that connected every home to the same river, the same sky, the same gods. And then, just like that, they began to eat. Soft laughter, the scrape of clay bowls, the rhythm of chewing that sounded a lot like breathing. Small altars. Big faith if you visited one of those homes. You'd see the altar tucked quietly into a wall. A few flowers, a burned wick in an oil lamp, a single piece of bread from last night's meal, left as an offering. The family didn't expect miracles. They just liked the idea that someone, divine or not, might share dinner with them. Hospitality was holy. They didn't call it worship. They called it living right. The scent of home, it's funny. The ancient Egyptians never used perfumes in their kitchens, yet the smell of food was its own kind of blessing. Every meal scented the walls. Bread and smoke mixed with sweat and dust. That was the smell of safety. It didn't matter how poor you were. If your house smelled like food, you belonged somewhere. When archaeologists uncover old hearths now, they sometimes find tiny bits of carbonized flour still stuck to the clay, fingerprints of dinner. It's proof that people here didn't just survive. They cared enough to make it pleasant. Bread and memory in Egyptian poetry. Bread often meant memory. To break bread with someone was to keep them alive in thought. Even when loved ones died, families kept baking the same recipes, the same way, using the same clay molds. The bread didn't change because memory didn't need to. You honored your ancestors not by mourning, but by repeating what they did well. Every loaf was both a meal and a monument. Children and continuity children learned to bake before they could write. They learned the songs for grinding grain before they learned prayers. It wasn't just practical, it was spiritual training, they were told. If you know how to feed the gods, you'll never fear them. It was Egypt's first theology lesson, taught with flour on your hands. So even when empires shifted and rulers changed, children kept kneading dough exactly as their grandparents had done. The empire could fall, but dinner stayed on schedule. When faith tasted familiar, that's the secret to how Egypt's religion lasted so long. It didn't live in temples or scrolls. It lived in habits, in what people cooked, what they shared, and what they offered. Faith didn't feel abstract. It tasted like garlic, smelled like beer, and looked like steam rising from a clay pot. If eternity had a flavor, it was barley and honey, the taste of something simple, repeated until it became sacred. A civilization fed by routine. When you step back and look at it all, Egypt's greatness wasn't its architecture. It was its consistency. Every sunrise was predictable, every meal familiar, every act of cooking a quiet rehearsal for forever. They didn't chase innovation, they chased balance. They trusted repetition more than revolution, and somehow it worked. The pyramids are impressive, but the ovens kept them possible. So it's time to talk about something Egypt never wrote hymns about, but lived with every day. Inequality. Because no matter how graceful a civilization looks in hieroglyphs, someone always gets the stale bread. Bread and Borders Egypt looked united from the outside. Same river, same gods, same sun. But your place on the Nile decided what went on your plate. The further you were from the palace, the plainer your meals became. Upstream, nobles dined on honeyed duck and wine imported from Syria. Downstream, farmers ate barley bread so coarse it doubled as sandpaper. Everyone thanked the same gods. Everyone prayed to the same river. But the Nile, generous as it was, didn't rise equally for everyone. The workers' diet let's start at the bottom. The workers, the men who carved stone, baked bricks, rowed boats, and built pyramids. They didn't live on scraps though. In fact, Egyptian workers were better fed than most laborers in the ancient world. They got rations, daily, consistent, and sometimes surprisingly generous. A typical worker's meal, bread lots of it, beer, even more onions, garlic, leeks a few lentils or chickpeas once in a while. Fish or dates. The bread kept them full, the beer kept them hydrated, and the onions kept them convinced it was all worth it. The great pyramid builders weren't slaves. They were teams of skilled laborers, powered by carbs and hope. You could say the pyramids were built on yeast and unions. Middle Nile's a step above them sat the scribes, artisans, and lower officials, the educated hands of Egypt. They could read, write, and eat a little better. Their bread was finer, less gritty. Their beer was lighter and sweeter. They had access to fruits and vegetables, figs, melons, cucumbers, and on festival days, even meat. They were the class that tasted both worlds, humble enough to remember hunger, privileged enough to eat something besides it. The luxuries of the elite. Up near the palaces and villas, the food turned theatrical. Nobles didn't just eat. They curated imported wine, honey, spices from Nubia, fish from the Delta, figs from Syria, almonds from the Levant. Their cooks were craftsmen. Their plates were art. Servants arranged food in geometric patterns. Tables weren't just set, they were staged. Banquets were less about flavor, more about reputation. The upper class didn't need to prove they had food. They needed to prove they had choices. The pharaoh's palate at the top sat the pharaoh, not just rich, but ritually rich. Everything he ate symbolized Egypt's stability. His bread was white, literally, made from the finest flour. His beer was spiced with dates and honey. His meats were roasted goose and beef. His desserts were honey cakes, sweet and heavy, the same meal. Every day, with the same ceremony, because if the pharaoh's diet ever changed, it might mean the gods had changed their minds. The cost of comfort, of course. All that luxury came at a price, and the poor paid it. When floods were late or harvests failed, the elite still ate. Their granaries were private. Their priests performed extra rituals to appease the river, which mostly meant waiting while everyone else starved, even in paradise. There were ration lines, and the gods, for all their fairness, seemed to enjoy fine dining more than fasting. Class in the kitchen, the divide wasn't just what people ate. It was how they cooked. Poorer families used outdoor clay ovens, fueled by dung or reeds. They cooked in batches, sharing with neighbors. The rich had kitchens with staff, ovens, and bronze utensils. Their food was filtered, strained, and served on faience dishes shaped like lotus flowers. different tools, different smells. Same river, the sounds of supper workers' dinner sounded like laughter, clinking jars, maybe a fight about onions. A noble's dinner sounded like flutes, polite conversation, and servants trying not to make noise. The Pharaoh's dinner. Silence, except for the sound of chewing and the gentle clink of gold cups. Every class had its rhythm. You could tell who someone was just by how quiet their dinner table was. Shared festivals, separate plates even during national feasts. When the temples offered food to all, inequality showed up. The rich ate near the priests, under shade. The poor stood in the sun, waiting for leftovers from divine generosity. Still, for one day, everyone ate the same bread. It wasn't equality, but it was close enough to taste like it. The price of prestige to eat well in Egypt wasn't just privilege. It was politics. Nobles gifted food as favors. Officials hosted dinners to secure alliances. Even the smallest loaf could be a bribe, especially when it came with beer. A full stomach was loyalty. An empty one was danger. Egypt managed class, not through fear, but through feasts. Archaeology of appetite. When archaeologists open graves, they can tell status instantly. Poor graves, plain pottery, a loaf or two. Middle-class graves, fruit, small jars, maybe fish. Elite tombs, feasts carved in stone, platters, jugs, baskets, ducks, and oxen frozen mid-offering. The more eternal the menu, the higher the rank. Even in death, inequality was catered. Still, they shared the same river for all the distance between rich and poor. Egypt's food chain circled back to one source, the Nile. Everyone depended on it. Everyone prayed for it. And when it failed, everyone suffered. That shared vulnerability made Egypt human. It bound kings to farmers, priests to bakers, rich to poor. Different meals, same hunger. What remains if you could taste ancient Egypt now? You'd find it familiar. Sweetness, salt, bread, and smoke. The flavors haven't changed much. The hierarchy has. The elite feasts are long gone. The farmers' meals, somehow, survived. Because simple food lasts longer than luxury. Bread endures where banquets fade. When night came, Egypt didn't divide by walls or armies. It divided by what was cooking. You could walk through a city like Thebes and smell the hierarchy. The alleys near the docks smelled like garlic and fish, sharp and honest. The courtyards near the temples smelled like incense and roast duck, heavy, expensive, and faintly smug. And up near the palace, the air smelled faintly of honey and smoke. A scent that said, "Someone else lit this fire for me." But all of it, rich or poor, was Egypt. The same river breeze carried every aroma. It mixed them, softened them, and sent them drifting together. The Nile was the only true equalizer, patient, ancient, and perfectly indifferent to who got the better cut of meat. The meal as identity for Egyptians, food wasn't just sustenance. It was proof of place. A worker's coarse barley loaf said, "I belong to the land." A scribe's smooth white bread said, "I belong to the system." A noble's honeyed goose said, "I belong to the gods." And the Pharaoh's plate said nothing at all, because everyone already knew. But underneath all those layers of taste and texture, there was one shared belief. Food wasn't random. It meant something. Each meal reaffirmed your role in the order of things, a gentle, edible reminder of where you stood in the grand design. The generous pour ironically, the poorest Egyptians were often the most generous. When a traveler stopped by, they offered what they had: a crust, a cup, a smile. Hospitality wasn't luxury, it was insurance. Someday, when the Nile failed or a storm ruined the crops, they'd need the same kindness in return. So even the humblest houses practiced abundance in miniature. Not much, but enough. A handful of lentils, a sliver of onion, a bit of beer poured for luck. The same gestures that the temples made with gold and oxen, just smaller but equally sincere. Egypt, for all its hierarchy, was stitched together by small courtesies like that. The cost of refinement the rich paid a quiet price for their privilege. Their food was richer, yes, but also riskier. Honeyed meats, fermented fruits, imported wine that sometimes went bad in the heat. Archaeologists have found mummies of nobles with bad teeth, swollen joints, and hardened arteries. The ancient side effects of too much success. Meanwhile, the workers who lived on onions, garlic, and beer had stronger bones and fewer health problems. It's the oldest joke in history. The poor ate better than the rich. Just differently, the pharaoh might have ruled the world. But the onion farmer probably slept better. Food as a mirror riff. You looked closely. Egypt's entire social structure was reflected in a single loaf of bread. The outer crust was hard. That was labor. The inside was soft. That was comfort. Both parts needed each other, or the loaf collapsed. The same was true of Egypt. The workers baked the bread of empire, and the nobles sliced it. Different roles, same recipe. It worked because no one questioned the system too loudly. Or maybe they did, and history just didn't bother to write it down. The sound of the kitchen every night. Across the classes, the kitchens sounded the same. Grinding stones, crackling fires, voices humming, sometimes singing. The same human music, just played in different houses. Even the pharaoh's cooks, surrounded by gold bowls, used the same tools as the poorest baker: stone, fire, patience. The tools didn't care who held them. If eternity had a rhythm, it was the steady scrape of flour against stone. The sound of Egypt feeding itself one heartbeat at a time. The fragile light knit only took one failed flood to blur the lines between the classes. When the river ran low, even the rich grew nervous. Their gardens withered, their fish ponds dried, granaries locked their doors tighter, and the poor, well, they waited. They always waited. They knew the river better than anyone. They knew that patience was as vital as prayer. So they rationed, they endured. And when the Nile finally rose again, it was the farmers, not the nobles, who noticed first. They cheered, while the palace scribes wrote it down as if they'd done something about it. The real feast for all the feasts carved on tomb walls, for all the luxury meals historians love to describe. The real Egyptian banquet was much simpler. A bowl of beans, a jug of beer, a quiet moment at the end of the day. That was where contentment lived, not in palaces or temples, but in the stillness between hunger and sleep. If you asked an ancient Egyptian what heaven looked like, they wouldn't say gold or jewels. They'd probably say a full table and no debt to the gods. The fading divide centuries passed, dynasties fell, and slowly the distinctions between rich and poor started to blur, not in life, but in memory. The rich left tombs full of art and food, but the poor left descendants who kept baking, and over time that mattered more. Their recipes outlasted the palaces. Their traditions outlasted the titles. The humble barley loaf became Egypt's true monument, one that never crumbled. We've walked through fields, kitchens, palaces, and tombs. We've watched workers grind barley, priests pour beer, and kings dine in silence. Now, let's wander to the softer corner of Egypt's table. The part meant not for survival, but for joy, because even a civilization obsessed with eternity knew how to treat itself once in a while. The taste of celebration to the Egyptians, sweetness was a festival flavor. You didn't eat honey cakes every day. You saved them for feasts, for births, for harvests, for the moments when life finally exhaled. Bread was survival. Beer was routine. But honey was happiness. It wasn't just food. It was a feeling. A reminder that life could be kind between floods. Honey, the golden gift honey, was Egypt's first luxury. They called it the tears of the sun, and treated it like divine currency. Beekeepers worked along the Nile, moving their hives seasonally to follow the flowers. They wore linen hoods, hummed small prayers, and smoked the bees gently with dried reeds. Their honey was used in everything: food, medicine, offerings, and even embalming. You could live, heal, worship, and die with honey. A full circle of sweetness in the kitchens of the rich, honey-coated, roasted ducks and sweetened wine. In homes of the poor, it flavored bread or fruit when luck was good. And in temples, priests poured honey into jars as gifts to the gods. It was the taste of both devotion and delight, a rare overlap in Egypt's practical world. And because it never spoiled, it became a symbol of eternity. If gold could melt, honey would outlive it. Dates, the everyday sweet honey, was precious. Dates were practical. The date palm was Egypt's quiet treasure, useful, loyal, generous. It gave shade, wood, oil, and sugar. You could eat the fruit fresh, dry it for storage, or mash it into beer and cakes. It was the kind of ingredient that didn't ask for attention. It just made everything better. Date syrup sweetened porridge. Date pulp mixed with flour made portable snacks for travelers and soldiers, and dried dates filled bread for festivals. They were the Nile's candy. Humble, dark, and everywhere. Figs, grapes, and melons. Egypt's other sweets came from the land itself. Figs were the most common fruit, eaten fresh or dried. They were soft, filling, and slightly messy, which is probably why they never appear neatly arranged in tomb art. Grapes were rarer, reserved for the upper classes. Wine was expensive, but raisins were more democratic. A touch of luxury that even a scribe might afford once in a while. And melons, the unsung heroes of the desert. Juicy, cooling, and short-lived. The Egyptians loved them, but the climate made them fleeting. You couldn't store a melon for the afterlife, so they became the fruit of the moment. Ephemeral, like laughter. Pastries and cakes. When Egyptians baked dessert, they didn't think of it as a separate course. It was part of the meal or the offering. The simplest cakes were made from dates, honey, and flour pressed into molds shaped like animals, flowers, or sacred symbols. Some were fried in oil, others baked in small clay cups. They were dense, sweet, and meant to last. Festival bread was often decorated, scored with patterns or stamped with seals of the gods, because even dessert had to look devout. The sweet politics of offerings. Desserts weren't just eaten. They were donated. When someone brought food to the temple, the sweet things came first. Honey cakes for Ra, date bread for Hathor, figs for Osiris. The logic was simple. Sweetness pleased the gods, and happy gods flooded the river. So every baker who shaped a honey loaf for a festival wasn't just cooking. They were praying with sugar instead of words. The meaning of sweetness for Egyptians, sweetness wasn't indulgence. It was harmony. Life in the desert was harsh, and sweetness felt like balance, proof that not everything had to be toil. They didn't chase pleasure the way later civilizations did. They practiced it quietly, with the same moderation they applied to everything else. Honey wasn't a craving. It was a reminder, a little sweetness to make the bitterness of life taste bearable, dessert as memory every celebration. Harvest, wedding, festival ended with sweets, and when those ended, the leftovers became sacred. A child's sticky fingers from honey bread, a priest licking syrup from a bowl after a ritual, a worker keeping half a date cake for his wife back home. Tiny gestures of care, carried through time. The taste of Egypt wasn't just barley or beer. It was sugar shared quietly between people who'd worked too hard and still found a reason to smile. The sweet afterlife, even in death. Sweetness followed. Tombs contained jars of honey, dried figs, and date loaves. Sometimes, the dead were depicted eating them in murals. Reclining peacefully, one hand raised to a bowl, the other reaching for more. They imagined heaven as a banquet, table filled with endless harvests and deserts that never run out. Not excessive, not wild, just gentle satisfaction forever. No hunger, no heat, no bitterness, just the taste of home, multiplied by eternity. A civilization of subtle joys that was Egypt's real secret, not abundance, but balance. They didn't drown in pleasure. They sipped it. Enough to feel grateful, not enough to grow greedy. Even their sweetest foods carried humility. Honey came from bees, which could sting. Dates grew high, where you had to climb. Every sweetness had effort behind it. Every joy, a bit of labor. It wasn't indulgence. It was appreciation. The soft smile after a hard day, the gentle lesson if there's one thing Egypt still teaches us. It's that sweetness is best when it's earned. A little honey after work. A bit of fruit when the harvest comes in. Pleasure that doesn't demand attention. It just arrives quietly and reminds you to breathe. That's what their desserts did. They didn't end the meal. They blessed it. We've eaten our way through palaces, temples, kitchens, and honey jars. Now we follow the water. Because in Egypt, you didn't plan a meal. You waited for a river to tell you what was possible. The Nile wasn't scenery. It was a calendar that moved. And every Egyptian, from pharaoh to fisherman, lived by its moods. 3 seasons, one god the Egyptian year, wasn't measured by months the way we do it. It moved in 3 great breaths. Akit the inundation, Pare the growth, and Shemu the harvest. Akit was the flood, the moment the Nile rose and drowned the fields in rich black silt. Pare was when the waters sank back and the earth woke up green again. Shemu was the dry season, when everyone hurried to gather what they'd grown before the next flood swallowed it all. And then the cycle began again. No surprises. Just the slow rhythm of survival, dressed up as eternity. Akit, when the world went under, it started around midsummer. The river swelled, turned red-brown, and crept over the banks. Villages retreated to higher ground. Fields disappeared beneath moving mirrors of water. No one farmed then. They fixed tools, brewed beer, baked storage loaves, and waited. Waiting was Egypt's favorite activity. It taught patience better than any priest. The flood wasn't scary. It was a promise. The gods were refilling the pantry. If the water came too low, people worried. Too high, they worried differently. Perfect height meant another year of bread. Pare the green season when the flood drained away. It left behind black soil so rich it looked oily. That was when real work began. Farmers pressed seeds into the soft mud with bare feet, wheat, barley, flax, vegetables. Cattle pulled simple wooden plows. Children scared off birds. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Meals during Pare were lean but hopeful. Fresh greens, small fish, the last jars of beer from last year's grain. Every mouthful tasted like maybe things would be fine. Temples offered thanks to Hopi, the Nile god, and to Osiris, who personified the crops themselves. Prayers were less about miracles and more about consistency. Egypt never asked for more than enough. Shemu, the dry season by spring, the fields turned gold. That was Shemu, the season of harvest, taxes, and blisters. Farmers cut grain with flint sickles, bundled it, and hauled it to state granaries where scribes counted every sheaf. Payment came later, in bread and beer rations, civilization's first salary. It was loud, dusty work. Threshing floors rang with the stomp of oxen. The smell of ripe grain filled the air, warm and sweet, the scent of survival. Feasts followed, the kind that felt earned. Grilled fish, new beer, dates, onions, laughter. Shemu was Egypt's payday, and everyone knew how to celebrate without pretending it was luxury. The calendar of faith at temples mirrored the river. When the flood arose, priests performed purification rites. When fields grew, they praised fertility gods. When grain filled the storehouses, they thanked the divine accountants for not losing track. Every season had its food festivals, beer festivals for Hathor, goddess of joy, bread festivals for Osiris, who taught agriculture, honey offerings for Ra, because sunlight deserved dessert. Religion didn't float above daily life. It flowed through it, like irrigation ditches between rows of crops. The science of patience, the Egyptians measured the flood with neometres, stone staircases carved into the riverbanks. Each mark predicted harvest, taxes, and mood. High water meant smiles. Low water meant ration plans. You can almost picture the officials watching the river like anxious bakers watching dough rise. Too little, and the empire went hungry. Too much, and it drowned. The Nile taught moderation before philosophy had a word for it. Food and forecaster. Rising and falling water decided everything on the table. If the flood was generous, bread was soft, beer strong, and markets full. If not, meals shrank. Barley instead of wheat, onions instead of meat, prayers instead of plans. That's why the Egyptians worshipped stability more than innovation. New ideas couldn't predict the river. Rituals almost could. The ritual of storage after harvest. Whole villages turned into storehouses. Grain was dried, sorted, sealed in tall jars, and stamped with official seals. Some was temple property, some royal, some communal. It wasn't hoarding. It was hope in ceramic form. Every jar said, "We will not starve next year." Granaries weren't just warehouses. They were sacred spaces, guarded by statues of cobras and jackals. The hum of full storage was Egypt's version of prayer music. When the rhythm broke once in a while, the Nile betrayed them. Too little rain in Ethiopia, and the flood came thin. Hunger crept in quietly, polite at first, then merciless. In those years, people offered extra food to Hopi. They sang hymns, opened old jars, divided what was left. Even in famine, they shared, because Egypt believed greed offended the river. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But faith kept them from despairing between harvests. The eternal loop year after year, generation after generation, the same pattern played out. Flood. Sow, reap, feast, repeat. It sounds monotonous, but that monotony was comfort. Every repetition proved that God still cared, the river still remembered, and life was still worth organizing around bread. To break the cycle was to tempt chaos. To keep it was to live forever, one season at a time. The poetry of routine Egypt didn't write love poems to innovation. It wrote them to rhythm. The river rose. Hearts calmed. The river fell. Work began. That steadiness, more than monuments or gold, was what made the civilization last so long. While others chased progress, Egypt perfected patience, and patience, apparently, ages better than ambition. A meal in all seasons. If you tasted Egypt in Akit, it would be sour beer and stored bread. In Pare, fresh greens and optimism. In Shemu, roasted grain and exhaustion. Each season had a flavor, but all three tasted like gratitude. Because whether the flood was kind or cruel, Egypt always ate with thanks. The river sighs again in the dark. The fields sleep under stars. A frog croaks somewhere, and the water moves as it always has. Egypt breathes in rhythm with its God. Flood, sow, reap, rest. The world's oldest lullaby. If you've made it this far, you've basically shared a whole meal with history. We've eaten bread with farmers, honey with priests, wine with pharaohs. Now we watch the plates clear, because even when Egypt's empires fell, its appetite didn't. People kept cooking. They always do. When the gods went quiet, the end didn't come with a bang, it came with trade. New rulers arrived, Persians, Greeks, Romans. They brought new gods, new taxes, new spices, but the kitchens didn't care. The same ovens baked the same loaves. The same beer bubbled in the same clay jars. Base still guarded the hearth, even if nobody remembered his name. Faith changed language. Food didn't need translation. The Greek tastes, when Alexander's men arrived, they built cities that smelled like both Egypt and Athens. Greek colonists tasted Egyptian beer, made a face, and kept drinking anyway. They swapped olives for onions, wine for barley brew. Soon, Greek words filled Egyptian recipes, artos for bread, oenos for wine, but the rhythm stayed Egyptian. Even Cleopatra, educated in Greek, ate like her ancestors, honey, bread, and figs. She ruled a hybrid world, but kept an ancient pantry. The Roman appetite, then came Rome, loud, hungry, confident. They turned Egypt into an empire's breadbasket. Grain shipments left Alexandria for Rome every season, feeding emperors who never saw the Nile. The workers who loaded those ships probably ate the same. Barley bread their great-grandparents had. Only the destination changed. Rome might have owned Egypt politically, but Egypt owned Rome's stomach. The continuity of the kitchen by the time temples closed and hieroglyphs faded. Egypt had already hidden its soul in the kitchen. Ordinary people kept the faith in flour and fire. They still baked bread shaped like sun discs. They still poured the first sip of beer on the ground. They still thanked the river before eating. The rituals no longer had gods attached. but they had meaning. Habit became holiness. And maybe that's how civilizations survive. Not through monuments, but through muscle memory. The new religions, the old meals when Christianity arrived, then Islam centuries later, Egypt adapted again. But it never forgot its old menu. Christian monasteries baked flatbread, identical to ancient temple loaves. Muslim families in medieval Cairo still broke fasts with dates and honey, the same combination offered to Hathor thousands of years earlier. Even the language remembered. The word for beer in Coptic Henket sounds just like the one carved on Old Kingdom walls, because some words refuse to die while they're still useful. The farmers who never left out in the delta, nothing really changed. The same families planted wheat and barley, argued about water rights, and trusted the river more than any ruler. Pharaoh, emperor, caliph, they all came and went like passing clouds. But the bread came out of the oven on time. It still does. If you walk through a village near Luxor today, the smell of fresh loaves from a clay oven isn't nostalgia, it's continuity. The taste that endured you can still eat Egypt if you know where to look. Dates dipped in honey, beer brewed from barley and flavored with herbs, flatbread baked on hot clay. Tourists call it traditional. Egypt just calls it dinner, because time may have changed the temples, but the table never moved. The river remains, every civilization that touched Egypt. Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, British, thought they'd reshape it. But the river always won. It fed everyone equally and forgot their names. Its floods still leave the same black earth. Its fish still flash silver under the moon. And people still gather along its banks at dusk, tearing bread and laughing about nothing. The same meal, the same rhythm, the same patience. Memory you can eat, that's the beauty of Egypt. It didn't need to preserve its story in books. It preserved it in recipes. Every time someone stirs honey into tea or sprinkles cumin on bread, they're reciting an old prayer, one that never made it to parchment. You don't have to believe in the old gods to taste what they left behind. You just have to eat slowly. The hum of continuity civilizations rise, crumble, and turn to dust. But the small things, the recipes, the gestures, hum quietly beneath history. A mother handing her child a piece of bread. A fisherman sharing his beer with a friend. A family saving a bit of food for tomorrow. That's how Egypt really lasted. Not through pyramids or dynasties, but through patience and repetition. The eternal wasn't stone, it was dough. The final offering, so let's end where it all began, beside the Nile at night. The water glows faintly under the stars. Somewhere, a baker's fire still burns. The smell of warm bread drifts over the river, soft and familiar. Someone whispers a small thank you to the land, the gods, the water, whoever might still be listening. They tear the bread, share it, and eat. The same gesture that kept Egypt alive through flood and famine, faith and forgetting. A quiet act, endlessly repeated. The world's oldest goodnight